Hey folks, let's talk about Vaesen. If you've watched my recent videos, you're probably aware that I've been running a Vaesen campaign. After playing through 4 Vaesen mysteries, a mix of homebrew and pre-written ones, we just concluded our campaign. So after these 11 sessions, over the course of 5 months, I feel that I have enough experience with the game to share my in-depth debrief. I'll talk about my learnings, what went well, what could have gone better, and share my overall thoughts on the Vaesen RPG. But first, let's briefly go over what Vaesen is. Vaesen builds itself as a Nordic horror role-playing game. It's set in the so-called Mythic North, essentially a version of 19th century Scandinavia, where creatures from Nordic folklore, the eponymous Vaesen, are real. These include well-known creatures like giants, trolls, mermaids, ghosts, and werewolves, but also lesser-known creatures like Vetir, sort of like little gnomes with animal features, the ash tree wife, a sort of tree guardian, or the Spurtus, a diabolical insect-like creature. While most humans can't see Vaesen, the player characters all have the so-called sight, often as a result of past trauma. They are part of the society and operate out of an old castle that serves as their headquarters and can actually be upgraded over the course of the campaign, lending them various benefits. Vaesen adventures revolve around mysteries. There is an inciting event, often somewhere remote and usually involving a Vaesen. The player characters receive an invitation, journey to the place of interest, and investigate the situation. In addition to the primary conflict involving the Vaesen, there's always a secondary conflict that revolves around the humans, and that may or may not be directly connected to the primary conflict. The situation escalates over the course of the adventure and eventually results in a catastrophe unless the player characters are able to resolve the conflicts. This may involve a ritual of some sort to banish the Vaesen, or some other solution to put an end to whatever's causing the conflicts. Vaesen adventures are typically episodic and follow a well-defined structure. If desired, it's totally possible to weave these into a larger metaplot. Personally, I actually like the episodic structure, so I did not inject any metaplot like that. Alright, let's briefly go over the 4 adventures that I ran and talk about my challenges and learnings with each of them. Note that some of this may sound a bit familiar if you watched my last video on homebrew versus published adventures. I'll keep it brief though. The first adventure I ran was from A Wicked Secret, which is an adventure collection for Vaesen, the first one of these that was published. As you see, there are 4 total mysteries included here: the Silver of the Sea, A Wicked Secret, the Night Sow, and the Song of the Falling Star. I only ran one of these, the Silver of the Sea, so let's take a quick look at this. In this adventure, the player characters travel to a remote island, uncover a plot involving human sacrifices to a mermaid, and hopefully put an end to it. As a side note, yes, mermaids and Vaesen are not the pleasant creatures we all know from Disney movies. I really like the vibe of this adventure. It's oozing with flavor. Let's flip through this a little bit. So here we have the prelude of what prompted all of this, some background information. There's a nice map of the archipelago where this adventure takes place. Here we have the invitation that you can read out to the players. That's how they get involved. And then we have the first of many NPCs in here, Oscar Udgren. He's essentially the person that sent this letter to the players and asked for their help. Now we have a description of the journey, which is a big part of all Vaesen adventures. There's a lot of flavor here, right? Because they travel away from the more urban environment where they live to a typically remote environment where they're far away from what they know, and it's hard to get help and things like that. That's a big part of the atmosphere. And then we get into the, there's the arrival, and then we get a description of the countdown and catastrophe. So that again is part of every Vaesen adventure. each adventure comes with at least one countdown. As we'll see, there are actually a couple more in here. So that's a way to increase the tension and make sure to move the story forward, especially when things are stalling. As you see, here's already another countdown. This is because one of the other NPCs here is able to supernaturally affect the players in various ways, and it's important to bring those elements in as well. And then at the end we have the catastrophe here, what happens when they don't resolve things in time. They actually have very limited time here, essentially only a day or so, because the next human sacrifice will happen on the next new moon, which is like the day after they arrive. Another map, now we get a bunch of location descriptions. We get some challenges that can take place at this inn, for example, some clues that they can find, more NPCs. These guys were really cool, Pete and Pace. More locations, more challenges, more clues. So that's kind of the typical structure of a published Vaesen adventure. The art is really awesome. Some tips for running it. There's a showdown at the end, which is actually quite intense, to be honest. I have a feeling that if you run it as written, it's pretty much guaranteed to be a TPK. Another really cool picture. And then the aftermath, which I'll also talk about. So this all seems great at first glance, but I ended up struggling quite a bit when running this adventure. For one thing, the information tends to be scattered across many different pages. Let's look again at the inn as an example. Right, so here's the inn, and we have this challenges section. So that's mostly like essentially stuff that can happen while they're at this inn, right? So Udgren, who invited them, recommends that they speak with the waitress, Justina. It talks about how they need to pass a manipulation test to make her reveal what she knows. There's some stuff that they can find out from godmother Abella and her sons Pete and Pace. There's an argument with some sailors that Udgren can get into. There's this old fisherman that can walk up. There's more stuff about Pete and Pace. So it's sort of a lot, and it's not really ordered in a particularly logical fashion. And then there's a clues section, which I find overlaps a lot with the challenges, right? So, but this is more focused on specifically the information that they can gain as opposed to the stuff that can happen. But I find that those are pretty intertwined in practice, right? So here again, we see what Justina can tell them, what they can find out when they look at Pete, but then there's more mention of, Pete and Abella below, and this stuff is kind of all over the place, to be honest, and is really hard for me to find the right thing at the right time. The other thing is that there's simply a lot going on, which adds significant cognitive load and requires quite a bit of mental juggling. Again, the multiple countdowns are an example of what I'm talking about here. So here's the main countdown. Then there's the second countdown for the supernatural events. And then there's actually a third one, because later Pete and Pace will start stalking the player characters. And there's a dedicated countdown for that here, right? So you can make sure that all happens. And finally, there are also many assumptions about how the players will act. In practice, my players ended up acting differently, and this made it a lot harder to feed them all the clues necessary to solve the mystery. I know this caused some minor frustration for my players, as they were sometimes unsure how to proceed. The countdowns did help with moving things forward, but it still felt a bit janky. And to be clear, this was not an issue around clues being hidden behind skill checks or anything like that. There is some of that in the adventure as well, but we didn't really bump into that too much, and it would have been relatively easy to work around. What I did like about the adventure is that there's no straightforward solution where everything ends in harmony and everyone lives happily ever after. Quite the opposite, actually. The actions of the characters have far-reaching implications. In our case, they put an end to the sacrifices, but this ended up causing the abundant herring to disappear for many years, as it would turn out, resulting in widespread famine in the region and likely causing many, many deaths as a result. This sort of set the right expectations for the rest of the campaign. Unlike D&D, where the heroes tend to save the day, we would deal with much more moral ambiguity here. Anyways, while I was able to make things work somehow, I came close to throwing in the towel after running this adventure. Since I own all the official Vaesen books, I tried to pick another, hopefully more suitable adventure to run next. But while the themes and vibe of the other adventures looked great, they all seemed to suffer from similar issues. For example, I took a close look at A Wicked Secret. This is the longest adventure in the book and the one that this book is named after. Let's just briefly flip through this. You see the structure is pretty similar. The conflict, the journey, there's a map, there's a bunch of NPCs, countdown, catastrophe, locations, another nice map, lots of clues, lots of NPCs, more clues, more locations, more clues, more NPCs, more locations, more challenges, more clues. Confrontation. Here's the climax, escape, and then we get to the end. In this adventure, there were so many different NPCs, each with their own motivations and complex relationships, that I knew this would be even harder for me to run. At that point, I decided I would give up on published Vaesen adventures entirely and try my hand at homebrewing instead. My hypothesis was that a homebrew adventure would end up being easier to run, since the bulk of it would naturally live in my head, and I'm quite comfortable improvising everything else as needed, based on where the player's actions take us. I was also curious about Vaesen's tools for generating homebrew mysteries. My first stab at this was a mystery I called The Haunting of Hargsta Manor. Without going into a ton of detail here, it revolved around a myling, a spirit of a murdered child, that was haunting a manor. The secondary plot involved a ruthless businessman that was trying to trick or pressure the owner into selling the manor. I'll just briefly scroll through this. Here's the invitation that I read out to the players. Here is the conflict section, similar to the published adventure. There's a main conflict. There's also a secondary or local sub-conflict around this businessman kind of pressuring him to sell. There's a bunch of locations, some clues that they can find. I had some images just to set the atmosphere. And then I came up with some NPCs, of course. There's the myling itself. There's the Hargsta family and their staff. There's this businessman and his assistants, and some other locations in town that they might investigate. So, for the most part, my hypothesis turned out to be correct. This adventure was far easier for me to improvise at the table, involving less lookups or struggles around pre-written assumptions. Overall, this allowed for things to play out in a much more organic fashion. On the flip side, it was perhaps a bit too easy. We didn't end up having any physical combat, which is fine, that's not what Vaesen is really about, but I also didn't end up going particularly hard on the characters in other ways. Vaesen is supposed to be a game where they get pushed to their limits and emerge with physical and mental scars. But that's not really my GM style, and I would struggle with the same thing in later adventures. Still, I was becoming slightly more optimistic and ready to try this at least once more. So, while I tried to keep things reasonably lightweight with The Haunting of Hargsta Manor, it still ended up being a decent amount of work. Coming up with NPCs, locations, clues, writing things down, generating photos, and so on. So for my second homebrew adventure, I decided to challenge myself. I would limit myself to only sticky notes, in this case virtual ones in the Miro app. Here you see what this looked like, and this actually ended up working really well. This adventure revolved around a traveling theater troupe and a jealous Nissa, a sort of gnome-like creature. Here's the actual conflict, the primary conflict, right, which can take up pages in a proper adventure. I just have a couple of words on a sticky note. There's a secondary conflict. I do have a little countdown, but all of this is like very, very brief and just enough for me to improvise it at the table. Here's some setting information about where this takes place, how the player characters get involved. I ended up sort of tying it into one of their dark secrets. I have some NPCs here. We have a couple of locations. Again, each one just a couple of notes on a sticky card, some clues that they can find at these locations, a couple of events that might happen, and some other insights that they might gain. A couple of NPC portraits as well, and a photo of the location, the main location where this takes place. And yeah, this ended up working really well for me. Most of the session ended up being improvised. The players even came up with a very clever solution to the problem that would have never occurred to me. That actually tends to be my favorite approach to GMing. Not really trying to force a particular story, but rather present a tricky situation and leave it completely up to the players how they want to deal with it. In addition to involving less prep, I find that this keeps me much more engaged as the GM. It's fun to see what the players come up with and be forced to react accordingly. So overall, I was happy with the outcome, but just like the previous adventure, I feel like I didn't go hard enough on the player characters. Then again, at this point, I had pretty much resigned myself to the fact that Vaesen, as presented in the book, is simply not my style. And I decided that rather than fight this, I would simply make it my own. So my version of Vaesen is much more lighthearted, even goofy at times, in a darkly humorous way perhaps, kind of harkening back to my Warhammer Fantasy roleplay days. For example, the herring famine caused by the player characters in the first adventure ended up becoming a recurring theme, with townspeople they encountered bemoaning that fact, sort of a running gag. That's how I like to run, so screw it. The fourth and final adventure I ran was something special, as it was neither homebrew nor published. A friend of mine, together with their writing partner, had written their own Vaesen adventure, and they were looking for playtesters before publishing it. So, after reading this adventure, I immediately thought this would be a great adventure to run for my group. I also provided them some nitpicky feedback based on the kinds of things that I ended up struggling with in my prior Vaesen adventures, and they were nice enough to incorporate some of it. Without sharing too much here, this adventure revolved around a woodwife who was causing trouble for a remote Norwegian farming town. I ran this over the course of 2 sessions and really loved the overall mystery and the flavor, and I would recommend this to other Vaesen GMs in a heartbeat. My players really enjoyed the mystery as well. That's not to say that I didn't have a few challenges. Mostly, there were a lot of families and names to keep track of. There's also a timeline of events that happened, and it was a little tricky for me to convey a consistent narrative to the players whenever they asked questions to the various NPCs. There were also 1 or 2 things that fell through the cracks on my side. And again, I did not go hard enough on the player characters. But those are all more reflective of my general challenges running Vaesen, rather than shortcomings of this particular adventure itself. This was a really nice mystery and a fitting end to our Vaesen campaign, so thanks for letting me playtest this, Wayne and Dee. So, after running this 5-month Vaesen campaign, what are my conclusions? Overall, my sense is that Vaesen is a good, perhaps even very good, game that's also very much not for me. Truth be told, I was almost ready to throw in the towel after running the first mystery, and I really struggled with the published adventure. But then I decided to approach things with a growth mindset and figure out a way to overcome my challenges. This led me to my experiments with homebrew adventures, which improved some aspects but had their own issues. At this point, I'm pretty confident that I could continue to improve as a Vaesen GM. If this was a job, that's probably what I would do. But it's not. It's supposed to be a fun hobby and a creative and social outlet. And there are simply tons of games that I enjoy running more. For example, Outgunned, EasyD6, DCC, Cortex Prime, or Warlock. Or perhaps games I haven't had a chance to get to the table yet, like Shadow Dark. So therefore, I'm perfectly fine with the conclusion that Vaesen is not the right game for me, and to move on to other things. But let me try to outline my likes and dislikes in a bit more detail. Let's start with my likes. I love the setting. The Mythic North has a great vibe and is a really nice departure from typical fantasy or sci-fi fare. There are a few elements of the setting that I care less for, such as the strong presence of Christian religion. For example, there are Vaesen that very specifically protect the church. I would have preferred for the Vaesen to be more rooted in older Nordic myths. But it's easy enough to pick and choose which elements you want to bring into your campaign, so this isn't an issue. I also really like the character creation system as well as advancement. My group did a great job coming up with interesting characters that all have their own reasons for seeking out Vaesen-related mysteries. And they were able to advance their characters in interesting ways, whether improving their skills or picking talents that help them in specific situations. As a side note, rules as written, XP is handed out at the end of each session, and it's pretty easy to get the 5 points that are needed to buy in advance. Since our sessions tend to be on the short side, probably averaging 2.5 hours of actual game time, this means that our rate of advancement was higher than might be intended in the game. But since I also knew that we wouldn't be playing a long-running campaign, I didn't worry about this. Otherwise, I would probably tweak the advancement a bit. The headquarter rules are great as well, although we only engaged with these in a limited fashion. The group invested in a bunch of castle upgrades, which provided various benefits to them, such as a seance room that allowed the occultist in the group to gain some more insights at the start of a mystery. The ideas around threats that could manifest after they upgrade the castle are also interesting and could add to the overall experience outside of the actual mysteries. But I never ended up rolling any threats, and I didn't want to arbitrarily fudge this. And of course, the production value is through the roof. This is something that Free League nails with all of their products, and Vaesen is no exception. The book looks and feels amazing, with thick, well-textured paper. The layout is solid, the art is fantastic, and that's no surprise since the RPG is rooted in an art book by Johan Egerkrans. But let's move on to my dislikes. First off, the book is somewhat poorly organized. I often found it hard to find things in the heat of the moment. Instead, I often had to resort to searching through the PDF, but of course that only works when you know the exact search term. In terms of the mechanics, I thought the core mechanic was fine, but not all that great. Even though it involves dice pools, and those pools can get quite large for things the characters are particularly good at, it felt surprisingly swingy. Characters with high dice pools would often fail, while characters with small pools would often succeed. The system also feels unnecessarily crunchy in some areas, especially given that Vaesen is not a combat-oriented game. For example, the initiative system could be greatly simplified by using group initiative or something similar. I think we only had 1 or 2 actual fights in our campaign. Overall, it's a decent medium crunch system, but it doesn't stand out to me as a revelation. It's really not much simpler than D&D 5e, 2D20, Cortex Prime, or other medium crunch systems. And some of those other systems feel more fun to me. I also don't like that pushing always adds a condition, especially in situations where characters might push a roll in order to avoid getting a condition in the first place. They take one condition from the push, fail anyway, and gain another condition. This feels more frustrating than fun, and is probably part of the reason why I ended up going less hard on them in later adventures. I get what experience the mechanics are supposed to support, but as I've realized, that experience just isn't really for me. I prefer more lighthearted games. And then there are the published mysteries that I already talked about earlier. As mentioned, these have a lot of rough edges. The themes are fun, but there are way too many assumptions and too many things to keep track of, so I really can't recommend these. I've actually discussed this with a number of other GMs. Many of them feel that while Free League does a solid job with their systems and the production value is best in class, their adventure design tends to be lacking. As a side note, I'm pretty lukewarm on the overall mystery structure, where there's always a Vaesen-related main mystery and a separate sub-conflict. I tend to prefer for things to be more freeform and organic, so there's just a little too much structure for my taste. And finally, there are a lot of surprising gaps in the rulebook. For example, there's little to no guidance on how to let players use the crystal ball, perform seances, and things like that. These things can actually dramatically change how the group experiences and solves mysteries by front-loading some clues they normally wouldn't get until much later in their investigation. And since there are entire character archetypes built around this, such as the occultist that I had in my party, as well as various talents and headquarter upgrades to invest in, I didn't want to shortchange the players. I think this mostly ended up working out okay for us, as withholding clues is never a good strategy with these games anyway. Still, a bit more guidance about this and a few other related things would have been helpful. Finally, a few other observations. These aren't so much about Vaesen itself, but realizations about my own gaming preferences. As it turns out, I don't like running serious horror games. My sweet spot are more lighthearted games, perhaps with slightly silly NPCs and a good dose of dark humor. I probably could master running horror games if I put effort into it, but it's not something that comes naturally to me and not something I really enjoy. So my Vaesen game almost certainly felt much less serious and intense than intended by the authors. In addition, running mysteries is difficult for me. I had never really run a mystery-oriented game actually, perhaps with the exception of the occasional fantasy adventure that skewed a tiny little bit in that direction. Especially with the published adventure I ran, there was a lot to keep up with, resulting in a major cognitive load. There are several parallel countdowns, clocks essentially to tick, ensuring that the clues find their ways to the players, and so on. And of course, the players inevitably take a completely different course of action than the written adventure assumed. There's also time pressure to drive events in the right direction in order to resolve the mystery before everything goes up in flames after a day or so. And again, I could probably get better at this over time, but it's just not really my jam. So will I run Vaesen again in the future? Maybe, but probably not. For now, I'm happy to put it to the side. I have an itch to play and run some other games instead. Well, that's it for now. I'm sure I'll get a lot of comments from folks that love Vaesen, so please tell me why I'm wrong. In all seriousness, it's a good game, even if it's not for me, so I'm glad folks are having a great time with it. As always, likes and subscribes are appreciated as well. See you next time!